Now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about basic object editing in 3ds Max 2010. We've looked at how to create a primitive object. Now we have to see how in the world we can edit that object however we like. So in the command panel, make sure that you're in the Create tab and make sure that you're in geometry mode. And we're going to use just standard primitives to demonstrate here. I'll go ahead and select a box. And I'm going to create a box. Now here's a neat little trick. If you go ahead and click in the center of the grid there in the viewport and drag, the box is going to be placed over here in this lower quadrant of the viewport. But if you want the box to be centered around the mouse cursor, what you want to do is go ahead and hold down the control key. So just hit control on the keyboard and drag, and you'll see that now you can make a uniform perfect square here, a nice cube. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll give it some height. And that's it. Then I'll just right click on the mouse to end the creation process. Okay, so we can see here's the name, box01, and the color, which we can actually change if we wanted to. But I'm not going to go ahead and do that. What I'm going to show you is how to go ahead and modify this object. How do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. In the command panel, if we go to the second tab, it's the Modify tab. You can see that now we have the name here. Here's the color. We also have a set of parameters down here in this rollout. We can change the length, and we can do that two ways. We can click and drag using these little arrow icons here to scroll through the different values, as you can see. So we can change the length, the width, the height. And if you don't like these numbers, for example, you don't like the height set at 39.197, you can go ahead and type in 40 and just go ahead and use exact numbers by inputting them in the field. Down here we have the segments for the length, width, and the height. And if I change them, you won't really be able to see the change there. So what you need to do is just turn on wireframe mode, wireframe unshaded, so you can see the actual wireframe of edges on this object. I'm also going to turn off the selection brackets there. And if we change the length segments here, we can see that we can create a more dense cube here. So now the box has a more density to it. It has a lot more segments and edges here. So it has a lot more geometry. Alright? But we're pretty much limited here. We can't edit this any more than just changing the length and width and height segments here, as well as the length, width, and the height measurements of the box. Let's say we wanted to go in here and start really editing this and do some serious heavy-duty polygon modeling. Well, we can't do it like this. Unlike other 3D packages in 3ds Max, you can't just create a primitive and start editing it right away. You have to create a primitive first, set up these basic parameters however you like, and then you have to convert it. You have to convert it to a polygonal object that you can go ahead and edit. In 3ds Max, we have two different types of polygonal objects that we can edit. We have editable meshes and we have editable polys. Okay? So how can we convert this primitive to one of those, either a mesh or a poly? Well, there's a few different ways you can go about it. The first and easiest way is to just have your object selected, and anywhere inside your viewport, just go ahead and hit the right mouse button. This will open up the quad menu. From the quad menu, down here in the bottom, we have a Convert To option, and we can convert to different types of objects. We can convert this to NURBS, which we're not going to do, and Editable Patch, which we're not going to be working with. We're focused more on meshes and polys because these have to do with polygon modeling. So let's go ahead and select Editable Mesh. Once we select that, you notice that the object here in the Modify tab changed. It's now called Editable Mesh here. And if I go ahead and click on that little black plus icon and expand this out, we can see that we have 5 different categories here. We have vertex, edge, face, polygon, and element. Also, all of our different options down here change. We now have all these new parameter rollouts. We have a selection rollout, soft selection, edit geometry, and down here we have a surface properties. Okay, so what does this all mean? Well, when an object is an editable mesh, we have a deeper and higher level of access to the object that allows us to edit it like we could not edit it before. So what we can do is we can select vertex mode here, for example, and you can see that we now have these blue vertices, blue dots on our object. And these are vertices, and we'll talk about editing this stuff later. Okay, it's not really that important right now in this video. Okay, so what's the difference between editable mesh and editable poly? Well, with editable mesh, we have access to the object's vertices, the object's edges, faces, polygons, and elements. Okay. Editable mesh is pretty good for doing polygon modeling. However, it's very limited, and I don't recommend using it. Why? Well, editable mesh doesn't give you access to all the great tools in 3ds Max for polygon modeling. Why not? That's just the way it was made. Editable mesh is pretty limited. It's not very flexible and doesn't give you the options to use the wide assortment of polygon modeling tools available in 3ds Max. But probably the biggest downfall of using editable mesh is the fact that in 3ds Max 2010, they've introduced the graphite modeling tools, which we're going to be talking about later. The graphite modeling tools gives you access to hundreds of new tools and features that help make your polygon modeling job a lot easier, and we're going to be taking advantage of those new tools in this tutorial. Unfortunately, those tools are not compatible with editable meshes in 3ds Max 2010, which makes editable meshes, well, at least in my opinion, pretty much obsolete. At least in our case. So we're not going to be using editable mesh. Instead, what we're going to be doing is converting this to an editable poly. So let's right click, go down to convert to, and we'll go to convert to editable poly. Okay, so the object still looks the same. If we look over here and expand the editable poly, we'll notice that we have access again to vertices, edges. This time, however, instead of having access to faces, we have access to borders, which is a very useful thing. We also have access to the polygons that make up the object, as well as the elements of the object. Okay, but we're going to talk about that later, where we're going to focus strictly on those things. All right, so editable poly. What are the pros of editable poly? Well, editable poly gives you access again to all these different sub-object components, the polygons, the vertices, edges, things like that. But it also allows you to use the graphite modeling tools. The graphite modeling tools are only compatible with editable poly objects. So since we're going to be doing polygon modeling exclusively in this tutorial, we're going to be using the graphite modeling tools with editable poly objects. Okay? We can also drop modifiers on top of objects here. So let me go ahead and hit Ctrl Z to undo a few times to go back to the box, the primitive. If we go to our modifier list here, we can actually drop an edit poly or an edit mesh modifier. As you can see, when I drop that on there, I have all my polygon modeling tools available to me, and I can also expand this, and I have access to the vertices, edges, borders, polygons, and elements of the primitive object that's now an editable poly, because I dropped the edit poly modifier on top of it. But we'll talk about modifiers later. We're not going to get into that now. Okay, so finally, we're going to be sticking with editable polys throughout this entire tutorial. We will not be using editable meshes. Alright, so that's going to do it for this video. In the next video, we're going to go ahead and talk about editable poly and go into a deeper look and have a look at the different options to us available through edit poly and see what we can do. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.